here with you in November. I had to cancel due to illness, so I'm sorry that I had to cancel on a very short notice. But I'm very happy to be with you in the kitchen today. I would even like to be really in the kitchen with you and not in a digital kitchen, but okay, we can change that. Two corrections to the introduction. So first thing is I'm not with the Heidelberg University, but with the Heidelberg University of Education, which is a different institution. We don't have a Twitter handle, so I'm used to this kind of confusions. The second one, I'm actually the UNESCO chair at the Open University of the Netherlands, but I only have a small position there, so I have a small affiliation still to the OU in the Netherlands. But I've worked there for 13 years, and I'm quite happy to have still the connection to the Dutch research community via the OU. Yeah. A third one, I'm also affiliated to a Center for Open Education Research at the University of Oldenburg, which is a nice wrapper for scholars in the field of open education to exchange ideas, come together, give each other feedback, develop projects, and so on and so on. I want to talk today about open education and transition, social movement, or evidence-based research domain. I would like to give you a short tour around the world of open education. Most of you, I assume, know what it is about. I would like to talk a little bit about open education resources, about MOOCs. I would like to show you some research we conducted in the Netherlands in the context of the SUNA project. And I want to discuss a little bit the state of affairs at the end. This is also what the title relates to. I'm sharing my slides in a second with you. And please let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can.
Okay, good one. Open education. As you probably know, it's a term with a lot of confusion. There are many dimensions to the concept of open education. So if you talk about open education, some people talk about access options, some people talk about costs, some people talk about pre-qualifications. So open is many things to many people. It is often termed as a kind of umbrella term. I would say it's an umbrella term for activities of education institutions to broaden access to learning opportunities, which is a very general definition, and a lot of activities can fall under that. It is also defined as an activity, but also practice. So it's not only a theoretical basis, but it's also how you actually do things. And other authors have coined it as a kind of open system of thought. So being able to be open in the way you think about education. And of course, I mean, who does not want to be open? It's a kind of jump on concept. In the discourse, openness is a positive thing, first of all. So every university wants to be open, and we all support openness. But maybe we also need to think that if we define openness, we also need to define closedness. So we can't define open without being closed. I think a very interesting paper by Edwards from 2015, who really thought on a more philosophical level on this dichotomy between openness and closeness. Like you've heard already, I mean, if we talk about open education, we always need to talk about in what form and for whom. It's a very unspecific concept. And in recent times, open education has also received the dimension, and Jeremy Knox has framed that nicely. It's constantly loaded with politics and Silicon Valley solutionism. I will come back to that later. Just to take you a little bit around the historical development, there is a T missing. I just see that now. Some of you might know this. This is a historical overview from Sabadi and co-authors who start the historical development with the foundation of the distance teaching universities of course, you could even go back further. You could talk about Comenius and teaching all things to all men. I wouldn't want to start from the very, very beginning, so I just took a more recent approach to an historical overview. What you see here is that before the 90s, there were distance teaching universities, there was open source software, there was something like an open education movement. I will talk about that also later. And you had two types of institutions. You had, and you still have them, you have the open universities, which are different than distance teaching universities. Open universities do not have requirements for pre-qualifications. Distance teaching universities can have the same pedagogical principles and online learning facilities, but they require pre-qualification. Like the German Open University is not an open university in that sense, but they are a distance teaching university. And then you all know the history of the open courseware movement, open content. We have Creative Commons, sharing of resources. We had this MOOC phenomenon. Yeah, we should actually lead this graphic a little bit further, but you can see the OU dimension is still there, the MOOCs, the OER, and the open access dimension is also part of this problem space. And one thing I think is very important in the discussion about open education, and I call that always the ecosystem of open education. I think we are moving in a strange space here because we have, on the one hand, formal education institutions. And by the way, of course, not everything which happens in open education comes from them, but I would say they are the biggest activity holder in open education. We have them on the left side, and on the right side, we have mostly learners who are in a non-formal learning context. And in between this space, we have open education resources, we have open courses, we have MOOCs. And I think this strange ecosystem has a lot of implications how we actually look at open education and how we evaluate also specific activities. Let me dive briefly into OER. I also told Marcus already I have 70 slides, but only 40 minutes, so I will probably skip some stuff or speak very fast, but I don't want to do that because actually you won't follow me. So I do that briefly. Open educational resources, teaching and learning material that make use of open licensing, permitting reuse, improvement, repurposing for educational purposes. I'm dealing with this topic already quite some time, and the origin of the idea comes a little bit from this model, from the model of a modular content hierarchy, which has been developed by colleague Eric Duval, who has died some years ago. And we had around the year 2003, we had always the idea, yeah, we need to have a digital authoring approach in education. So we start with very low granular objects, media, we put them together to information objects, then we have learning objects, we assemble lessons from that, and then we come to courses. And it was a wonderful idea in theory, and it always had the assumption that we wouldn't need to start from scratch, we could share resources a lot, and we could actually much better build on the work of each other. So that was, for me, one of the starting points for the idea of open educational resources in higher education. And I have to say we failed a lot with this assumption that the design of education works like that. Another component of this OER movement or OER idea is the open education resources life cycle. So it was always the idea that this life cycle never stops. So authors take resources, repurpose them, adapt them, make them freely available again. And we've conducted in exactly that time several European projects in which we collected hundreds of thousands of resources for the domain of business and management, for the teacher training communities, and so on and so on. Really 100,000 of resources. And we saw that this exactly didn't happen. We didn't see a lot of inflow from the users who repurposed these resources back into the systems. So somehow this assumption didn't work quite well. It might have worked, but there are also several problems in measuring and following your resources. And then another component of this OER idea was that you can have very, very different levels of reuse. So you can reuse a resource as is. You can combine different open education resources by aggregation to a new course, for example. You can actually re-author a resource, so adapt it, or you can repurpose it into a new context. For example, you take something from an undergraduate level to a graduate level, or from this faculty to the other, and so on and so on. The assumption or the arguments for open education resource are always, of course, the taxpayer perspective, which I think is a very valid perspective, that you say, hey, we pay our public servants, our researchers already. Why should they produce closed resources which are actually published with publishers and so on? So fair enough. There was always an assumption of costs, of course, economical dimensions, that you would have less costs if we would build on the work of each other. There was an expectation that OER would actually in itself lead to innovation because we collaborate much more via the resources, and then we would also get acquainted with different ideas about the same subject and so on. There are assumptions that quality improves with the use of OER and that equality improves also with the use of OER. It's more or less the same overview, and I need to jump a little bit faster. I think our effects of OER is still at the moment very, very low. There are some studies with clear cost effects, mostly coming from US textbook studies. So in the US, you have very high costs for textbooks, and there are several studies in which proprietary textbooks, high costs, have been compared to low-cost textbooks. And of course, effectively, you could see that students need to spend less money for their learning. I'm not sure about the Dutch context. I think you are also using a little bit textbooks, but in the German context, this is absolutely not a pattern that people do, so that they don't buy commercial textbooks for teaching. And looking at the student statistics, the costs for learning material are getting lower and lower each year. So in the German context, this would be not a huge effect. There is little evidence in studies beyond case studies or assumed effects on any innovation factors coming from OER implementation. I would say there's also no evidence for quality effects through the reuse or adaptation. But there is some evidence for equality effects, but very context dependent. For example, there are several studies in which you could show that if you offer open education resources in economies which cannot afford traditional publications, that this can, of course, increase access effects and improve the situation for learners. On the other hand, it's also methodologically, of course, very hard to measure actually licensing effects. I mean, this is one of the paradigms that have been proposed in the OER community, that you compare proprietary resources with open resources. It's also a question what are direct and what are indirect effects. And I said it already, reuse and adaptation is another thing which is very hard to follow. I asked this once to the Creative Commons if they have any idea about the tracking of resources. So if they know how often Creative Commons resources are reused and adapted, they have also no statistics about that. So it's unknown how often resources are really adapted, and it's hard to follow. In general, the OER paradigm follows the 5R framework by David Wiley. And I would agree to Martin Weller that a focus purely on reuse gives a very content-centric view, and openness not only relates to content, to the learning content, but also to practice and to other dimensions of education. In general, I had always doubts that this approach of licensing comparison studies makes sense at all. There are several studies in which authors have just compared a proprietary resource with an open one and then deducted any results from that. I think it's not the license, but the design that actually makes the quality of a resource. And I'm happy to see that even some of the adepts of the open educational resource research have actually recognized that a lot of these studies are very much under-theorized, and that we need to have a more complex approach if we really want to find out the role of open resources. Just want to summarize again, Jeremy Knox at University Edinburgh, he summarizes main issues of open educational resources. He stresses that it's about removal of restrictions, but there is often a lack of ideas about education itself. So it's about making resources available, but what is then the pedagogical approach for using them? It's about focusing on freedom, but there is a lack of consideration of pedagogy, of didactics. What is the role of the teacher and the education institution? And last but not least, if we talk about using OER, the use of OER by learners, we also have an assumption of an autonomous and self-directed learner, of course, which puts up a high barrier for selecting your resources yourself, learning from them. Although, of course, this is an opportunity for people, which we've seen also during the pandemic, due to no other options, that the use of OER has also increased. So I would close that part on OER that I think the most striking questions on OER are more from another perspective. What are the educational approaches that make effective use of OER, and which models serve also as a good example to interface between institutions and the individual? So how can we actually have a theoretical, pedagogical, and didactical underpinning, and not only talk about publishing resources and then don't think about the actual use of these resources anymore? So question is the value proposition of open education the release of learning material under open licenses, or should it be more the design of education in social environments in which a global population can participate in higher education without restrictions of access, prior knowledge, and costs? And this is, of course, also one of the sustainable development goals. High quality education is one thing that is part of that. And I want to build a bridge now to the other sub-community. And by the way, it's a little bit weird in the open education world that these communities are not so much integrated. So there are several literature studies that show that these are more or less two only very slightly connected communities in the research field. And with this quote of Guntram Geser, I want to take the bridge to the MOOCs, to the MOOC sub-community. And again, here I don't want to spend now a lot of time in telling you about the history. You most probably know that, you followed that. I didn't even update the statistics here. MOOCs have been announced as being dead already hundreds of times, and we always see an increase of usage, more universities, more students, more courses. And I think the MOOCs are a phenomenon that is here to stay. The question is, how much will universities, higher education institutions will play a role here in this context? And I have later a slide in which you can see that during the pandemic, of course, we saw another jump in usage. So the MOOCs also functioned as an alternative educational infrastructure where we didn't have a lot of choice in that time. And many people just took the opportunity to go into MOOCs and to learn in these open courses because they had no other options of having access. Before I introduce a little bit our work we've done in the SUNA project, I would like to introduce some assumptions that were communicated in during the development of MOOCs. So the first one was the fear of unbundling. So there was always a discussion if MOOCs would lead to an unbundling of university functions, that universities would have kind of a fragmentation of activities, that they would have production facilities, that they would have a commercial part, and so on and so on, and that the unity of teaching, research, and service would be more or less destroyed through the use of MOOCs. I think there are some unbundling activities have been going on. If you look at FutureLearn, for example, in the UK, it's a very interesting example of the Open University putting up a concurrent service with a similar offer, but on a commercial level and so on. So, but I think this fear of unbundling has not been confirmed, and the institutions haven't extremely changed the way they work for now. Then there was, of course, you know, the Christensen disruptive innovation assumption. There was a prediction that MOOCs would replace even universities, and in X years, these institutions would not be there anymore, and so on and so on. This has also not been really confirmed. Then there was another interesting prediction about MOOCs and higher education, that actually higher education would also go away because it's the zero marginal cost paradigm from Jeremy Rifkin. He said that it will not cost universities more if they have a specific amount of learners online. It doesn't matter if they're at 100,000 because of cloud computing and so on. So he predicted that everybody will have access to university education, and because of the zero marginal cost phenomenon. Also very doubtful. The question is, okay, are they a perfect storm for higher education, or have MOOCs really were just a storm in a water glass? So what were actually the effects of institutions being busy with MOOCs developing? We've discussed this whole question on replacement of higher education in an article. We compared a little bit the cathedral and the bazaar, and we had the idea that these two paradigms would work together and that there would be a kind of hybrid approach to open education. The world has moved again, I have to say. This is from 2019. I would like to come back to this later. Let's see how much universities will be still involved in the open education space in the future. And this is one of the figures I still owe you. You can see in March 2020, start of the pandemic, I think there were 1 million new learners in 48 hours who picked on Class Central a course. So just to show you again how much this infrastructure, this open course infrastructure, has been used during the pandemic. We had the luck to be able to conduct a 5-year research project on MOOCs in the Netherlands. Started 2015, ended 2020, and we were working together with the University of Utrecht, and we were funded by SURF, NWO, NRO, and we had the idea to have a systematic multi-level analysis of open education. The project was combining 3 different perspectives. We looked at the micro level, the learner level. At the University of Utrecht, we had a PhD project dealing with self-regulated learning skill acquisition. I won't talk about that today. And we had 3 PhD projects at the Open University of the Netherlands. So one on motivation and intentions, one on the course level, on scaling of support, feedback, and interaction, and one on the organizational level, more looking at what did MOOCs do with universities and not the other way around. Sorry, I have to drink something for a second. And what was interesting, and I like this approach, although the ministry changed the funding instrument in the middle of the research, which was a little bit unfortunate, but we had access to the innovation projects from 2015 and 16, which were sometimes dealing with MOOCs, sometimes with OER, sometimes also with Box and platforms, a little bit different. But we could look at these projects which have been implemented and funded. We could get data out of them. We could ask the project leaders who were responsible for these projects. And this was more or less the applied research part in which we did research about these projects. So that was the organizational level mainly. Let me maybe start with the individual project first. So the first thing we did on this level—
We cannot hear you anymore. Sometimes your sound disappears. Sorry.
Thank you.
Sorry, for me at least. I don't know if for the others this is also the case.
Okay, actually, for me it's fine. So it might be a problem on your end.
I didn't change anything. So, But I'm coming nearer to my microphone, so I hope that solves the problem. Thanks. So the first thing you all know about MOOCs is that there is always this assumption MOOCs are so bad, many people drop out, and it's just bad online learning. And just reminding you again on this ecosystem idea, we had the idea that that might not be an objective assessment of what happens in MOOCs. And we wanted to develop a different approach to looking at success in an open online learning context. And this is also, again, if you look at the enrollments, outdated because in the pandemic it has risen again. But the general approach to looking at the quality of MOOCs was that we transferred the formal educational model and measurements to this context. We said, okay, we have not many who make up a certificate for ending up a course, so it must be bad. That was more or less also in the research world the assumption, and we thought, okay, this is not what we hear from learners. There might be a different story behind that. And we thought, okay, the dropout myth is more or less a question of perspectives. If you look from the institutional or from the individual learning. And we built here on work from the open university context from Vincent Tinto, who said, yeah, it's important limitation in the work on dropout is that there is a tendency to ignore perspective of individuals. Such a definition always implies a connotation of inferiority of the individual dropping out. That was exactly the starting point. And by the way, that's from 73. Interesting, very, very old quote that we built on. And we try to develop something different. We try to measure learning success in MOOCs not on the basis of achieving certificates or completing course parts, but setting individual intentions. And we more or less divided learners in 3 groups. We had groups in which the intention follows the behavior. We had groups in which the intention was bigger than the behavior, so that was they didn't achieve the things they wanted to achieve. And we also set a group of learners whose intentions were actually less than they actually achieved in a course. So a different perspective to learning success. And we just looked at really explorative at such a difference in measurement. For example, one of our own MOOCs at the Open University on marine litter. If you would have looked at that from a traditional perspective, you would say, okay, only 10% successful learners, 90% dropouts, because only 10% achieved the certificate. We looked at the intentions there, and we saw that we had indeed still some traditional dropouts who did not achieve their intentions, but we also saw an interesting phenomenon of learners who achieved more than they intended. So there is not only a dropout, but also a drop-in phenomenon in this context. We also looked at barriers for learning, and that was another assumption that if you talk about dropout, you always say, okay, then the design or the environment must be bad. What we found in the research is that many factors influencing the barriers for learners are not MOOC related. They are more related to the environment in which they are in, or they are related to academic skills, but it's not that we can directly infer from dropout directly a bad design. So we looked systematically also at barriers which have been constructed. And then we had in another PhD project also study, I don't know if you're aware about this, but mostly learning satisfaction in a formal learning context is taken as a kind of bad measurement, bad proxy, because it has shown to be not very related to actual course success in the formal education context. We looked at the role of learner satisfaction in the open education context, and it was highly related to intention fulfillment, and we thought that it plays a different role here because of the motivational setting in which people are. So learner satisfaction is in open education actually an important proxy for achieving your intentions. I jump now a little bit because I don't have a lot of time. Concluding, I think this part of the SUNE project, I think what higher education institutions can learn from that is that they might have, via the MOOCs, an opportunity to develop educational formats for very different learners. They already serve the traditional degree seekers. They might also partially serve the certification seekers who only want to have a sub-qualification or a specific course. But there are also a lot of knowledge seekers who are not in these courses to have any degree or certificate, but who just want to take knowledge out of that and who still can have a positive learning experience. And that makes the assessment of success in these courses a very complex measurement. The second level of the SUNE project deals more with the course design aspects, with the scaling of higher education. Don't know if you know the projections for the higher education space. This is an old figure. I think now in the pandemic, for the first time, we have less people enrolling in higher education. Of course, in Germany, at least that's the case, because also of the mode that we have at the moment, no presence and so on. So numbers are going down, but long-term numbers are expected to go up. So we will have to serve more students in the future. And I think it's still a historical moment, and you can say bad things about Sebastian Thrun, but having in October 2011 160,000 people in an online course, I think is a historical moment. Also, if only 20,000 completed it in a traditional sense, but I think it was one of the first global educational events in mankind's history. So, and this high number translates to what has been coined as learning at scale in the research community. So very high numbers of learners. And we started this project with an assumption that we say, yeah, okay, but scale in terms of the amount of learners doesn't mean scalability. So we were interested to see in how far these designs and approaches would be able to deliver, would be able to maintain high quality despite an increasing or large number of learners at a stable level of total costs. So if you look at scalability of educational designs, you have, of course, the teacher bandwidth as a kind of limiting factor. And we developed an assessment instrument in which we looked at constructive alignment, complexity of learning activities, interaction, and formative assessment and feedback. I have to be a little bit faster. I skipped the iron triangle. If you want to know about that, you have to read it yourself. One very small comment. There is an assumption of or a theory of Terry Anderson that if you are able to develop one of the three interaction directions, student-student interaction, student-content interaction, student-teacher interaction, at a very high level, you can neglect the other two. So that was a theory developed in the Open University context in Canada, also backed by evidence. We wanted to see if this interaction equivalency can work also in the MOOC context. We looked at 50 MOOC designs. We looked also on which cognitive level they would be working, if it only happens on a factual knowledge level, if it's really about skill building, about competences, and so on. And we analyzed a random sample of 50 MOOCs with the idea in mind to identify scalable practices in the course design. And we could identify several examples on these three interaction directions. We had student content. We saw a lot of automated, elaborated feedback in multiple choice questions. We saw video-based hints. We saw hints at the moment of incorrect answers. These were automated, scalable best practices in the student content interaction. We also saw numerous scalable best practices in the student-student interaction. Peer feedback is a very good example of a scalable practice, but also guided discussions with prompts and guidelines on answering and commenting. On the student-teacher interaction, we saw mostly a kind of proxy video answering as a scalable instrument in which the teachers recorded and looked at several assignments and commented on them, and learners were expected to deduct based on this video then via a self-assessment their own assessment. So we
5 minutes.
Yeah, okay. I'm going a little bit faster now. So the last project dealt with the institutional level, and we looked mostly at the way the institutions who work with MOOCs and how far they facilitated this process. And the assumption was always that these MOOCs would work like a Trojan horse. So you would assume that if institutions would be busy in this world, they would become very professional in online learning and so on and so on. We started there with a study on the challenges for open education. We analyzed there, we saw a lot of need for professional development, for teaching staff, but also support mechanisms. We looked specifically if there are implementation differences between open MOOC projects and open educational resource projects. And we saw that there is a different logic behind that, and we would also recommend a different implementation strategy. So contributing to talking better about what specifically we mean with open education. I jump over this one. Okay, I'm trying to wrap up my talk. So where are we today in the open education space? I think it has been, especially in the last 2 years, a very interesting time, but also one where several things happened which I think need a good discussion and where we are heading to. So the first one, I think we definitely need to improve the evidence base for specific interventions that we do in open education. There was this SRI education comment on the OER Evidence Hub, where they demanded that there needs to be stronger empirical research studies and meta-analysis on the effects of specifically open educational resources. Very old comment here also from Richard Bart, that most accounts of open education have been anecdotal and descriptive. So I think this is still very much the case in many research accounts on open education. The second one, and I think it's interesting that you are trying to connect these different worlds also in this kitchen, but I think in the actual implementation discussion, it's sometimes very difficult to put them all under the same logic, because I think open access has such a different implementation approach and market need than open education that it's sometimes difficult to put them all in the same category. And I think it needs a very different approach if a university starts or higher education institution starts with open education activities compared to the open access discussion. So I would say we need specific approaches and strategies for open access, but also for open education. Then I have to say, which was kind of shocking for many people, the last bit of open infrastructure in the MOOC world has been acquired by a commercial institution. So the edX project is now part of the 2U agreement company. So that means more or less all open platforms are gone for MOOCs. I mean, there are some smaller ones left, but I think we also have a task to reclaim the open infrastructures again, not only to have access to research data, but also to be able to steer more or less the process and not give that only into commercial hands. Then I think we really need to have a dialogue, and I would like to talk a little bit more about that because that was the title of the talk, but I won't have time for that. We should have a dialogue about this idea of an open movement. So just finished a chapter on that and looked a little bit in how far the open education movement is a social movement. And I think there are some tendencies to push towards this social movement idea. I think we need to have a good discussion if we want to become a social movement and talk about equality, or if we want to become a better epistemic community that contributes with research to equality in education. One means to achieve that would be to really look much more into interventions than only into value-driven discussions. I mean, there is a lot of talk about equality and so on in the community, in the research area, but I think we really need to have tested approaches that have actually effects. And at the current time, this is a very much needed discussion because the pandemic has also shown that digital learning even increases the gaps and even widens problems which have been there before. So I think we have to take that as a topic back into the community and develop interventions which we test, which can help us to overcome these kind of problems. Okay, I'm finishing now. Last thing, if you want to see the defense of the last PhD project and the sooner project, this organizational level PhD, it's happening in February at 4 p.m. You can join via OUNL/live. Martine Schophuisen will defend her thesis there, and this is the last activity of the project. I'm cordially inviting you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Marco. That was a very interesting presentation, and there are also a couple of questions in the chat. And I will start at the top. Rolf asked, the German or Dutch taxpayer is not the US taxpayer. Is education a sector with competition?
A good question. I can tell it to you only now from the German context. I would say not in the sense like it is in the US. So it's not about competing with study competition. I mean, no question, but it's more, I mean, in Germany, you have this excellence universities. So this is more competition by acquiring research money, but not about education. So I think it's just a different type of competition that we're having there. I think the US situation is so specific because the MOOCs have been really a competing format. I mean, I was always flashed when I came to US conferences because they took this very, very serious. They saw this as a competition to the traditional higher education. This was in Europe, from my perspective, never the case. I mean, we saw that as an extension, but not as a replacement. And we wouldn't have thought that people just follow MOOCs for doing their masters. And in the US, they've taken it very seriously just because these very high enrollment costs. So I think this is really a Europe versus US discussion that we need to have there. I hope that answers the question.
I see a thumb. That's good. Another question was, I hope I don't miss anyone. Another one by Rolf. He asked, here's one question that I struggle to understand well. Open educational resources are fine as an abstract idea.
Yeah, I got it.
Okay.
Yeah. So Rolf, I have to say, I'm always surprised how easy the concept of OER is sold and how difficult it is in practice. So I think we are missing still, after so many years, we are still missing the easy tools to do this stuff. I always show in other presentations, I show this license compatibility scheme. I don't know if you know that. So if you have a restrictive license, and I showed you the different levels of aggregation that you can do, you are not allowed to combine this Creative Commons license with this license and not this license with this license. I'm sorry, but if I talk to teachers, they stop here. I mean, it's over now. I think it's much more complex than we assume. In the European project times, there were always approaches to address that technically. So for example, if you have this repository and you choose for a target license, the repository would show you a specific set that builds on your chosen license to be combined with, you know. But somehow these tools have never really gone into productive development. So it's a pity we cannot yet hide the complexity. I think if we could do that, it would become much easier. Fully with you here.
The next question is by Jeroen Bosman.
Yeah, also an interesting one. I think what I find interesting, and it's a very subjective answer, I'm sorry. So I'm doing now data science in education since 2.5 years. And for me, this is one of the intersection examples and also one that works quite well. it's funny, I'm even thinking of switching completely, so getting up my Moodle course and putting all the resources, for example, on GitHub and working with AirPubs notebooks and so on, because I mean, we can have interaction also outside or in a different tool. So I think in that sense, there is a very practical connection that you can actually use open science in open education. I mean but that's the easy part of it. I think conceptually, there is another similarity, and this is, of course, about sharing your course designs. I mean, I would be happy if we would practice, and some people are doing that nowadays, we would practice our syllabus and our courses the same way that some people share their articles and data very soon, because I think that's also one thing that I found difficult with the resources. I'm not so much interested in the individual resource, but I'm interested in the structure, the knowledge structure that somebody else would put on a topic, for example. So I think if we would approach open education via a similar sharing approach like open science is doing, we would have much more opportunities to identify also people we would like to work with than just sharing resources. So this is, I think, a level too low of granularity.
There is a longer comment by Victor. I'm not sure if this is a reply to what Rolf said or to another point. Victor,
no, it was meant as a general discussion point. I think the direct comparison of lectures between, you know, paid for education leading to a degree and open education is not a valid comparison. They are just two different systems with different goals. You know, lectures are part of a 2-year or a 1-year master, which has a structure, intended learning outcomes, it's tested, it has quality control. And if you get a degree, it's recognized worldwide, which is quite a thing, huh? Over the age we set that up. If I get a degree in the Netherlands, it's recognized in India and vice versa.
Yeah.
Now, so this added level is what you pay for. And then there is also the knowledge you get in you want knowledge, okay, and you can get that from all kinds of sources, and open education is one of them. I can also listen to a vlog or listen to a podcast. Whether universities should engage in open education, I think it's more than the question. Do you want to reach out to that market, and what for? Yeah. And in our case, we do capacity development, so I can very well I can very well see that it would help our capacity development mission if we would make all kinds of parts of knowledge available to peoples in the majority world. That they help even fellow teachers in universities that are now, I don't know, locked down in Ethiopia because they can't teach.
Yeah.
So there is this added, I think we should move a little bit beyond in the discussion about the number of clicks and how many people finished it, and you know the numbers. It's a bit beside the point, I feel.
But what you are saying is also, I mean, you know, this is driven by strategy, and what you've seen in many projects, it was driven by technology and not by strategy. So MOOCs were kind of hype and people invested in that, but it's not out of the strategy context. And I think there are some universities in the Netherlands who also use open education very strategically.
Nijmegen, Radboud does that in Nijmegen. They have a whole platform for that.
Well. Yeah.
But on the other hand, is then open education also structured around end goals, intended learning outcomes, that if you follow everything, or is it more, you know, a candy store where you take
I
bits
would
and
say,
pieces?
I mean, this is what we meant with the bazaar. I mean, but this is also the confusing thing. If you talk about open educational resources, sometimes you talk about full courses, sometimes you talk about a slide set, you know? So this is also so confusing in the discussion. I think it's a candy store more, I would say. But what you've seen also with in the recognition space is that this candy store can also, again, lead to a formal education environment. Sure. So I think that was also an idea that, yes, exactly. Or you do something like with this, that you recognize degrees and so on. This is also another dimension of open education, that you come to more recognition of prior qualifications and so on. I didn't touch on that.
Yeah, so maybe my comment is to highlight that there are many dimensions indeed to
fully agree.
Criticism or yeah,
fully agree.
Okay, thanks.
There's another question by Mike Monson. I don't know how to read it. If you scroll down, you will find it. I'm not sure if I don't get
Does
what this question. Yeah.
Open is equal, and does equal mean mediocre? Mike, could you maybe explain that one?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. Under the presumption that open means that it's the same price for everybody who accesses it. And from the provider's point of view, there's no incentive to be excellent because you're now in a non-competitive environment. So you're providing content that everybody has and it's accessible to all. So open is equal from that point of view. But the incentive to excel from the provider point of view is removed. So what impact does that have on education per se? And are we trying to get to this vanilla world where we can say, in theory, everything is equal, but nothing is excellent?
Cool, very interesting. I didn't read that out of this very brief comment. I think what you're saying is a perfect example of also I mean, we need to talk about economics here. I mean, we can't hide that discussion. It's a very important one. What you see in practice, this is exactly how the MOOC providers made money in the end, because they differentiated in the end still the courses, because the certificates or the tests, for example, Coursera started very early that they took the tests out of the open variant. You had to pay for that. Then the extra certificates have been shifted into the payment mode. Then, of course, if the resources are free, you can still add services which you pay for again and accelerate. And this is also, I mean, very honestly, in the open world, you have still then this who can pay for things still gets a better qualification. So it's also sometimes really a fake discussion. One thing to that, I don't know if you know that, it's many years ago, one of the old rectors of the Open University once proposed an OER model for the Open University of the Netherlands, which has been rejected restrictively. But exactly for that reason, I think, because I mean, what is then the role of this institution anymore if you put everything available online? What does that mean for education? What does that mean for the role of a teacher? That's very, very interesting discussion. Mike, I hope I could answer a little bit.
No, thank you. I just wanted to put it out there that there seems to be an ideological direction here and the ethos is not being questioned.
Yeah. There is a lot of ideology taking on here and value-based discussion. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have another question by Ivan Oliveira.
Should I say it myself?
Yeah, go for it. I just can't find.
I think my question is more on the way I look at most MOOCs in the States, and some of the stuff that I followed. MOOCs are more of a marketing tool, or at least they looked from the outside more like a marketing tools from universities, especially if you talk about the big universities in the States. And if I think my question is this the correct assumption, and if so, is this something adaptable to our situation in Europe?
Yeah,
where we don't need that marketing tool in principle.
Yeah, yes, I think you're fully right. There are some more or less marketing courses available there that more or less want to trigger people into the university or work really like a marketing tool. I think it has changed a little bit, so I think the quality has improved, at least in terms of the depth of content that is treated in MOOCs. I mean, if you look at Class Central, which is a ranking page, there are a top 100 of MOOCs. I would think that in these 100, you won't find any marketing. It's really in-depth learning opportunity. But one thing which I found surprising is I've showed you this scalability thing, and we looked at on which levels are these MOOCs happening. I think from an educational design perspective, the problem is that many MOOCs are still transferring factual knowledge, focus on this very low level, which of course is highly scalable. I mean, if you just want to transfer factual knowledge, I mean, this is scalable to the max. The problem is on which skill level are you targeting? If you are targeting an advanced learner community, you must also involve some other activities, because learning on higher cognitive levels involves just a different way of assessing, providing feedback, and so on. And I think this is the real challenge for the educational design of the MOOCs. So this was the idea behind the scalability analysis, to look a little bit. And most of these MOOCs were still on very low levels. And therefore, I also think it will never be a replacement as long as we don't solve the scalability challenge, because in our higher education context, we are working on all the levels, and we're talking about procedural knowledge, about factual knowledge. We have all these different levels in our teaching involved. And this is very difficult to scale in the MOOC world, I would say. And by the way, again,
Marco, are you still there? Marco?
Sorry, I was out. Yeah, I'm back. I showed you this publication by Justin Reich. So the US perspective is a very different one than the European one. So, and what we saw in Europe in several projects is more that we want to focus on diversifying education, but not replacing education. So that was always a very different paradigm. Sorry, I had a network outage.
No problem. Actually, we are running out of time, but can I ask one more question?
Yes, you get the slides.
No, another one.
Okay.
There's an interesting question asked by Rolf Rieperöck. He asked, to prevent commercial edu platforms to take unfair commercial advantage of free content, shouldn't we publish edu resources with a hybrid license, for example, non-commercial?
I did that in my early days. I don't do that anymore, because the problem with the non-commercial license is that you also avoid that the one-person consultant doesn't use your resources. So I think I don't do non-commercial anymore, just because I want the one-man show to use my resources. Of course, I don't want a big enterprise to do it. So the problem is that non-commercial is not very differentiating between these two. But in the end, I mean, it's also a question how much they can do. There are several examples of big companies not using Creative Commons licenses without any referencing and so on. But I mean, I don't know. I have to say, in general, I find this idea difficult that I need to restrict my ideas, because I mean, I'm happy if somebody does something with that, but that's a very individual decision.
All right. I thank you a lot for this very nice presentation and for answering all the questions. And thanks also to the audience for asking the questions and for the discussion. So yeah, we are done for today. Thank you all.
Thanks very much. Very interesting.
Happy to be with you. Marcus, I need to add the references to my slides, so it might take a little.
Take the time. All good.
Get you a PDF, yeah?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
Have a good day.
Thanks.
Hey.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Have a nice time.